All right, guys, this is guaranteed to be a little bit awkward, but it's the best way I can think of to efficiently answer everyone's questions and make sure I go into enough depth so it's helpful. I still don't feel great. So yeah, I think this is the way I can actually get this done. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the questions I got one by one, but I'll start with the essays because that was where the most questions were. So let me go over to essay number 1, which is the one about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Yeah. Okay. So first, the idea is that there's this tiger in a cage, and you have this clicker, and you know you've got a shock collar on the tiger, but you know it's going to run out of batteries. So you decide to classically condition the tiger to fear the clicker, so you can use it once the batteries run out on the shock collar. So, like with any classical conditioning, you take the unconditioned stimulus of the shock, and you're going to pair it with the neutral stimulus of the clicker. And when you do that enough, then the clicker is going to become a conditioned stimulus that causes a conditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus would be the shock from the shock collar. The unconditioned response would be flinching from the shock. So that's really important. They say, from the shock, because the flinching is also going to be a conditioned response, but then it's going to be to a different stimulus. So neutral stimulus is the clicker because it causes nothing to happen before you condition it. You have to condition the neutral stimulus before it does anything. The conditioned stimulus is going to be, again, the clicker. So the neutral stimulus, is the clicker when it does nothing, causes no reaction. The conditioned stimulus is the clicker once it causes the tiger to flinch. And then the conditioned response is flinching in response to the clicker. All right, so then the second part, you've already conditioned the tiger to fear the click sound, and you want to decrease the tiger's approach behavior. So now you're using the clicker as a stimulus that the tiger doesn't like to change its behavior. So when it approaches you, you'll click it, and then the tiger will learn pretty quickly not to approach you because something that it doesn't like happens when you click or when it comes towards you. So it's a positive punishment because you're decreasing the tiger's approach behavior by adding a stimulus of the clicker. Then the last part is the clicker gets taken away from you, but you have the ability to dispense small bits of food wherever you are, wherever the tiger is in the cage. And so now every time it moves away from you, you're going to dispense food, and that's going to be a positive reinforcement because you're adding a stimulus to increase the behavior. So you add the stimulus of the food, which causes the tiger, when the tiger moves away from you, as a consequence, it gets food, and that adds a stimulus that causes the behavior of moving away from you to increase. So that's why it's a positive reinforcement. Okay, so then essay 2, the thing I got questions about were the last parts. Give a concrete example of a time when we use mostly top-down processing to perceive stimuli. Reading is a good example of this because we don't read each individual letter. We read whole words at a time, and that's why we can read fluently and really quickly. Give a concrete example of a time when we perceive the world around us inaccurately. Let's see. You could use the McGurk effect for this. The McGurk effect is when people's lip movements say or look like they're saying fa, and even though the sound is really ba, we hear fa because we see those lip movements of fa. So we hear something that doesn't really exist or is inaccurate because of top-down processing, really. And someone asked me about that, whether that's a question about bottom-up processing, but it's really a question about top-down processing because top-down processing is typically where we get our errors because we're taking guesses about what might be true, and that can lead us to make guesses that are incorrect. So yeah, if you're going to answer that one with the McGurk effect, just make sure you explain it well enough so that I know that you know what the McGurk effect is. So I just realized there's a couple of questions about the essays that I didn't cover. One person said they couldn't find information about feature detectors in the slides. That's the stuff we were talking about, visual processing, and talks about how cells in the visual cortex don't respond just to bits of light or any old stimulus. They're looking for a particular feature, and that's why we call those cells feature detectors. And then there was another question about, let's take a look real quick. Oh, about giving food to the tiger in the first essay. Yeah, so I'm not one of the mistakes that people sometimes make is to think that I'm asking about variable ratio versus continuous reinforcement in these last two questions in essay 1, but I'm really not asking about that. I'm just asking about like the type of operant conditioning in terms of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment. So in terms of the last set where you're giving the tiger food, you're going to give the tiger food each time it moves away from you, and that's going to be positive reinforcement because you're adding a stimulus to increase the behavior. All right, so yeah, one more note on the essay questions. I realized that there's just one more question. Someone asked how specific you need to be for essay number 2, where we're talking about sensation and perception. And the definitions when you're, for example, defining sensation or defining perception, they don't have to be exactly the same definitions that are in the slides or in the book, as long as I know that you understand what you're talking about and describe it well enough so that I know that you understand what they are, then that's completely fine. So now moving on to the multiple choice. I had just a couple questions about multiple choice questions. So one, this is chapter 3, question 12, B and C. The first one is, what is the evidence that feature detectors exist? And that's just the fact that when you do put those little electrodes into the neurons in the visual cortex, those cells only respond to specific features like lines of a particular width at a particular angle, not just any old stimulation. So that tells us that these cells are feature detectors because that's what they're looking for is features. And are feature detectors influenced by nature, nurture, or both? That goes back to that video we watched with the kittens who were raised in the different environments, one that was all horizontal stripes and one vertical stripes. And the answer is that it's really both, because the fact that we have feature detectors is nature. That's all of us, that's just the way our visual cortex works. We have these cells that are looking for these features, and that's how we see things. But which type of feature detectors develop is nature. And you could see that because the kittens who were put in a deprived environment, for example, where they only saw horizontal lines, develop feature detectors only for horizontal lines or near horizontal lines. Then the last one is how accurate is our long-term memory? That just generally, I want you to just know that long-term memory isn't perfectly accurate. It's not like a video that we play where we can play it 1,000 times and it'll be exactly the same every time. Because we retrieve it from our long-term memory and we use constructive memory every time we retrieve information, that long-term memory can change for that reason, and also just because long-term memory tends to degrade over time anyway. So I think that wraps it up. Good luck studying, guys, and I hope this is helpful.